Well, here we go. Stepping right into a live stream with Cadell Last. Looking forward to this conversation. Critical questions for psychoanalysis and philosophy, with a little help from Lacan. So part of our getting together to record this conversation is motivated by an upcoming course you have through Philosophy Portal on Lacan's Écrits. Lacan is an interesting figure. He's also, as you put in the course page for it, somewhat of a controversial one. Why that is not for me to speak to. I'm certainly interested in his thinking. But before we get there, I think it would be interesting to develop a little bit of context together. And so we'll do that in a couple ways. But first of all, I'll say that for any of you tuning in right now or in the next couple days, Voicecraft is sponsoring a place for Lacan's Écrits via Philosophy Portal. All the information's in the show notes. But you can go to voicecraft.io/scholarship and you'll find out what's up with that there. So thank you and welcome, Cadell. I've got a question lined up for you to begin as we begin to present some of this context here. So if we take a step back about 130 years or so, and maybe you want to go a bit further back, perhaps around to the time where Freud is doing the bulk of his work. He had a long life, of course. But I'm curious what it is that Freud brings in to the sphere of thinking and ideas that you find so relevant and is relevant for psychoanalysis. Of course, Freud being the father of psychoanalysis. I guess one other thing to add is that when we begin developing a history of ideas, it always seems somewhat arbitrary to begin in any particular location, but context does matter. So maybe let's just take it from there. Who is Freud in the sense of his influence on the sphere of ideas?
Yeah, that's really going straight to the core of it, I think. And I think that's one of the reasons why that's a great place to start is because, you know, Lacan will famously say to some of his followers later in his career, you may call yourselves Lacanians, but I call myself a Freudian. So, you know, one of the things that Lacan will emphasize is that his project is governed by a type of return to Freud. And I think that what I see there, and I sort of staying in continuity with some of our previous dialogues, Tim, what I appreciate in Lacan, before I answer specifically your question, is the way he treats metaphorically the father. In this case, the father of psychoanalysis. He treats the father of psychoanalysis with a tremendous respect. He's not actively trying to deconstruct or destroy or kill Freud. And I think that has a meta super significance in the context of psychoanalytic knowledge as such, because we know in psychoanalysis that the tendency to want to kill the father, like the place of the emotional energy of killing the father, is front and center in analysis. So there is that sort of meta respect in Lacan's return to Freud, which I deeply appreciate and learn from myself, and try to embody myself in terms of, you know, the thinkers that I find relevant and useful in my life. But in regards to Freud, what does Freud bring to the sphere of thinking? In some sense, you could say that he brings to the sphere of thinking the other side of thinking, whereas throughout pre-psychoanalytic, before psychoanalysis, you could make the claim that philosophy, science, religion was operating on one side of thinking without a knowledge of the other side of thinking, that is the side of thinking that is the dream. The side of thinking that is just so you know, all of our thinking and all of our focus on thinking was in the light of self-consciousness, was in the light, was in the day. And there's just something that happens when we go to sleep, when we dream in the night, when we're not conscious, when we're unconscious. And that's unconscious is just a fancy way to say not conscious. When we're not conscious, this is the thing. We're still thinking. And that's the crazy twist. That's the crazy twist. And that's what Freud brings in, I think, is that when we're dreaming, when we're sleeping, it's not that dreams are just animal urges, animal or chaotic sense impressions. And it's not either supernatural, so that there was a divide that Freud was engaging with on the level of the dream. It's not the instinctual animal evolutionary history of cognition. It's not either a supernatural prophecy world of futures and stuff like this. It's thinking. And what is being thought in the dream is Freud's bringing it to us. And his answer is very, very specific. And I think a rupture in knowledge, which is, it's the subject's history. The thought we find in the dream is dramatizing through desire, replaying the day. And the older we get, and this is a crucial distinction between the child's dream and the adult's dream, that the older we get, the more complex and convoluted that thought becomes, because of, in Freud's language, the relationship between desire and the reality principle, the way in which our desires become thwarted, the way in which in some sense, what becoming an adult is delaying gratification, realizing that desires, you don't always get what you want. And a lot of what becoming an adult is learning how to come to terms with that. And in some sense, being aware of the way in which a self-conscious recognition of that is not equal to an unconscious working through of some of those more childish and developmental aspects of the history of our own thought. So I think that's what Freud brings to the sphere of thinking, and I think that a lot of what I'm trying to do with Philosophy Portal is thinking about philosophy after psychoanalysis, not seeing psychoanalysis as something that's irrelevant to philosophy, not seeing psychoanalysis as something which is antagonistic with philosophy, but something which can improve philosophy.
Yes, I hear that. It certainly seems to me that if philosophical thinking is not fluent in what psychoanalysis cares about relating with, then it's problematic for many, many reasons. Could you perhaps comment on, from your perspective, where you think Freud may be lacking?
Yeah. So in some sense, we have to start with the idea that every subject, no matter how brilliant, every subject, no matter how revolutionary, is on some level lacking, in the sense that it's never sufficient, in my view, to rest on one thinker alone. We always have to put thinkers into dialogue. We always have to put thinkers into relation with other thinkers in order to enrich them, in order to bring out their own gaps and lacks. And, you know, Freud, I think, most fundamentally was focused on neurotic psychology. His focus on neurotic psychology is, to me, central, but has its limits. And some of those limits have to do with other types of psychologies. So, for example, one of the interesting differences between Freud and Lacan, and I think that this might also have some interesting dialogue to be had between the relationship between Jung in this mix, is that Lacan focused on psychosis. Lacan's original interest was in psychosis, whereas Freud's original interest was in neurosis. So these are different clinical structures.
Could you outline some of the key differences between the two in terms of neurosis and psychosis?
Yes. So basically, when we're thinking in a Lacanian sense, we're usually thinking in the concepts of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And so you could say neurosis and psychosis are different problems of the imaginary, which are resolved through different symbolic laws. So, for example, in neurosis, you have oftentimes a imaginary fixation, which is dealt with through repression. The symbolic law of neurosis is repression. And what Freud's working with in analysis is the relationship between repression and resistance, with the strength of the repression being equal to the strength of the resistance. There's a type of law of pressure there in regards to the fixation of the unconscious mind. With psychosis, you have a different symbolic mechanism. The mechanism is foreclosure. So foreclosure is different than repression insofar as that the psychotic, in some sense, exists in almost a belief that they have the imaginary thing. In other words, the idea if the symbolic mechanism of neurosis is repression, foreclosure is abolishment of repression.
Right. So an image that's coming to me here a little bit is one of a volcano. We can think about the keeping the pressure in as far as neurosis is concerned as resisting the coming to the surface and the eruption into the real of that energy. And in the case of psychosis, what I'm getting is something like an affirmation as justification that the eruption of the volcano is just appropriate.
Yeah, I think that here I'm getting ideas about, for example, things I've read about Jung's Red Book. And like the writing of the Red Book, it's almost like this affirmation of the volcano.
Yeah, interesting.
Of the mind. And interesting in the context of Freud and Jung is that psychosis and foreclosure have to do with the no of the father.
Mm.
It's precisely what is foreclosed, actually. What is foreclosed is the no of the father, the prohibition. Whereas in neurosis, you're working with a certain founding prohibition. You're working with a certain no, a certain limit.
Okay. Well, perhaps let's return to this because I have a sense of how we might be able to connect things later in some important sense. As far as I relate to these notions, it's for sure not a matter of demonizing, of suppressing the energies, desires, quality in potential, qualities perhaps of what it is to be. And yet there's something about what it is to cultivate and conduit and paint and live and try and fail and attempt and reconstruct that all of a sudden requires a richness of metaphor that I think a volcano alone isn't going to quite do. But I'd like to return to this a little bit, because I'm curious about, as we develop a little bit more of the history there. And the reason I'm interested in this is for the sake of context, for the sake of the arena in which someone like Lacan is finding himself in, wanting to respond to, and in some sense, what you see him as bringing. So if you could fill in, I know Lacan was sort of born in the middle of the 20th century, Freud dying 1939.
That's right.
And so in the sort of, you know, if we look at World War I to World War II, these are clearly critical events in the 20th century that Lacan's in relationship with, and they also occur near the end of Freud's life. And of course, he doesn't live to see World War II play out. But what's sort of coming into the fore during this period, and what is sort of most stimulating of Lacan's sense of what the discourse is, what the world is that he's meeting and he's responding to?
Yeah. So there's some ideas there that are coming up, and actually there's a certain running commentary that in my work where I can engage with this in a deeper sense, perhaps, which is Freud. One of Freud's most interesting articles actually is his thoughts on war and death. This was a paper from 1915, and of course this is right in the middle of World War I. What's interesting about Freud and World War I is that World War I erupts right, in some sense, in the middle of his career, and has, I think, an enormous, perhaps under-theorized impact on his ideas, in the sense that all of the illusions about our civilized, progressive, mature ego get totally thrown out the window in World War I, where Freud sees a whole bunch of civilized personas go off and enjoy and get excited about killing. And then when he has many patients return from World War I, he's dealing with many traumatic repetitions, what perhaps today we would call post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think play a huge role in how he starts to theorize the death drive. So World War I becomes a crucial turning point in psychoanalytic thought, which causes a lot of rupture, both internal and external to Freud's psychoanalysis. Now, where Lacan's picking up Freud is actually at this critical juncture of the theorization of the death drive. And Lacan's picking up with the death drive. From the beginning, Lacan's picking up with the death drive. And this is very critical because Lacan is known throughout his living career as antagonistic with Freud's institutional schools, the various schools associated with the International Psychoanalytic Association. And his various criticisms of them, which we could go into, there's three main schools that he has his laser eyes on. But in short, they have to do with this under-theorization and the under-theorized importance of the role of the death drive in psychoanalysis, not only in psychoanalysis as it regards to patients, but in psychoanalysis insofar as the position of the analyst. And a lot of what Lacan is interested in, actually, is the existence or the non-existence of analysts, which I think is very critical. Lacan is basically saying, if Alenka Zupancic makes jokes about Freud saying, when you talk about sex, what are you talking about? What is this sex you're talking about? Like, there's nothing there. Lacan is almost saying to the International Psychoanalytic Association, who are these psychoanalysts that you're institutionalizing? Like he's in some sense even questioning the existence of psychoanalysts, and he's bringing in the problem of analytic training. Like, did we actually learn what it means to be an analyst? And like, for example, he's very critical of American psychoanalysis for producing on almost an industrial scale analysts. And he's saying, well, he says explicitly, like, 100 mediocre analysts will not help the psychoanalytic discourse at all. You know, like one, like he's like the existence of one is more valuable than 100 mediocre analysts. And specifically the role of the analyst, it seems to me, has to do with this relationship between the ego and narcissism and the ego and death as it relates to the identification, as it relates to our identification of desire. And what he's saying is that in the institutionalization of psychoanalysis, what we've done is we've institutionalized the ego identity, the narcissistic ego identity of the analyst, and we've made that the measure of analytic work and therapeutic results. When in reality, Freud's theory leads you to the conclusion that a true analyst is in and with death itself and has gotten rid of its narcissistic identifications and gotten rid of the idea that the analyst is the standard of health.
Yes, interesting. Yeah. So there's a few ways I'm feeling called to go with this. I want to refrain from commenting at too much length, because the second half of this conversation, I want to raise at least some critical questions to psychoanalysis. I think there's something in our shared relationship to philosophy that takes for granted, in some sense, the importance of psychoanalysis to philosophy. So perhaps we might comment on that a little bit later as well. We've spoken about this a lot, obviously, in terms of the criticality of, well, in some important sense, the question of know thyself and self-knowledge is very much bound up with at least what I mean by a care for engaging with what psychoanalysis cares about in terms of a relationship with desire, the relationship with this other side of, well, from my perspective, subjectivity in terms of the dreaming world and what have you. Now, how to characterize that becomes an interesting thing, but certainly sex, desire, context, what we're conditioned by, there's many, many domains of analysis, including psychoanalysis, which I think philosophy and philosophical thinking has to relate with. But it's almost a little bit too basic just to say that ivory tower, almost a kind of narcissistic type of thinking in some important sense. That's an interesting kind of connection there, that very same critique that you're identifying Lacan making about the analyst in terms of seeing themselves as a measure of things in terms of health for the subject or the analysand, and of course thinking philosophically, taking itself to be the measure of all things without recognizing its contextual embedding among a number of other factors, and how to relate with that in a dialogical process, a dialectical process, or to participate with the unfolding and the evolution of that in some important sense. So, okay, there's a lot of really good stuff there. Can you speak a little bit more to this point around health? I'm curious what Lacan sees as healthy, what Lacan sees as, if not healthy, then worth becoming, worth orienting to. In that sense, is there a is there an affirmative relation, like sort of compass-like relationship and attunement, the capacity for discernment? Is there a sense of life lived well and fully in Lacan?
It's a very good question, and because it's a very good question, it's also a very difficult question. The question of now let's go back to the fundamentals and go back to the basics in order to try and answer this question. There's no question that psychoanalysis posits itself, engages itself as a form of therapeutics. There is a sense of sickness. So there is a sense of a mental sickness. The problem comes in with the definition of health. What we mean by health. What does it mean to be healthy? And the weird thing is that if you pay attention to the early articles Freud's writing, there's something very subtle which happens at the very beginning of them as it relates to neurosis. Freud realizes very quickly that distinction between neurotic patients and normal subjects is a false distinction. And he starts to change this distinction very quickly. He moves from thinking there are neurotic subjects who will come to analysis and there are normal subjects in civilized reality. And he moves closer to the idea that everyone is more or less a bit neurotic. And there are some extremes of neurosis which would require analysis. The point is that this idea of an ideal healthy subject becomes problematized, that in some sense we all struggle a little bit with a little mental sickness. Basically, that's the crucial distinction. And I see that actually as a very liberating idea. I see it as a liberating idea because it gets you out of any phantasm of, oh, there's these other people over there who are healthy and have figured it out. And here I am struggling with my inner mental turmoil constantly. And am I ever going to be normal? Right. So this picture gets to me complexified in a way that at least for me, I find liberating. Now, what is the point of health? What is the point of going to analysis in the first place? You know, is it just to adapt your neuroses to a normative standard of what is healthy today or what it means to be a normal subject today? Right? A lot of my critiques of contemporary psychotherapy or other forms of therapeutics are that they seem to try to positivize the ego to a positive experience, like reify the way you think is right. And they're trying to get you back to work very quickly. Right? Like, do we have for example, like when sometimes we forget, and to me this is also the fragility and the impossibility of psychoanalysis, which is when Freud's dealing with his original patients, an analysis takes 5 years. There's actually no time. There's actually no official time on when you're going to be done. Like, and sometimes he's seeing patients regularly for many, many years. Right. So this is not psychoanalysis. At least the knowledge of psychoanalysis is not derived under the principle of let's get you back to work quickly. Let's make you a functioning tax-paying citizen quickly. Let's make sure you can, all of these things that bring into the question, I think, philosophical questions about politics and economy and what does it mean to be normal, right? And what does it mean to be healthy? Now let me stop bypassing the exact question and get to where Lacan is pointing. Lacan is basically pointing, I think one of his most important concepts is the concept of repetition And a very so if Freud's major concept is repression and working through repression and resistance on the level of the neurotic psyche, Lacan is thinking about repetition. And he's thinking about the repetition as the wellspring or the mainspring of the unconscious. And he's thinking about repetition on a particular level. He's not thinking about repetition of a genetic biological impulse. Like, let's say, for example, the repetition of masturbation. He's not thinking about that. He's thinking about the repetition of a signifier. He's thinking about the repetition of something linguistic, something symbolic. Let's say the name of the father, Cadell, the name of the father, Tim. He's thinking about that type of repetition as the wellspring of the unconscious. And it's almost as if we're trying to think about the insistence, the indestructibility, and the impossibility of the repetition of the signifier, and the way in which each subject's name struggles with that. Again, the insistence, the indestructibility, and the impossibility of the repetition of the name, the repetition of the signifier. In some sense, the question is, how well, if you're asking, what is a life lived well and fully? I think Lacan might say something like, a life lived well and fully is a life with fidelity to the repetition of the signifier at the wellspring of the unconscious. Something like that. And then we can maybe work with, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, what it means on some level is a fidelity and a truth to your desire. That doesn't mean immediate gratification. That doesn't mean immediate gratification. And what it does is it doesn't promise you an object of your desire, meaning you'll get the object of your desire. Because in some sense, the drive of the repetition of the signifier, or what is often called the drive, is the desire. Maybe we could say, even if there's no object of your desire that will solve your desire, you are the object, your drive, and the repetition of it. And now here, where would we see ill health? It would be something like the knotting up of this repetition, the knotting up of it, the getting tied up in a knot, in a way that is symptomatic, in a way that produces either neurotic fixation, psychotic disillusionment, even perverted disavowal of what is really true about your desire. And then maybe a final point is that something that has, to me, come out of Lacanian psychoanalysis is not a removal of the symptom for a normal mind, but an enjoyment of the symptom. It's a perspectival shift on what you thought was a symptom. In some sense, the path of unknotting the symptom is a love of the symptom, which is in some sense a love of yourself, right? And a deep and radical acceptance of yourself, of what you really are. And in some sense, a love of, and this is, I'm taking this from another Lacanian named, his name is Dr. Samuel McCormick, who does a show called Lectures on Lacan, who says a love of weakness, a love of impotence, in the sense that there's something which repeats in me. This is a Lacanian phrase, something which repeats in me that's more than me. Something in me more than me. Something which and this is, and you'll see this, maybe it starts to sound a little bit like what you might hear in Alcoholics Anonymous, but you start to hear something like, I accept that there's something in me that I'm powerless to change. Like in Alcoholics Anonymous, you have to accept I can't do this on my own. Right? There's something in me that I'm powerless to do. And a lot of it is loving, speaking to, being with, accepting this part of ourselves, Peter Rollins might call this something where he thinks grace, for example. And so that brings in the religious language of and it's true that Lacan does bring us to something religious as well. And I think that that's something where both Jung and Lacan speak to something that was lacking in Freud, which was a sensitivity to the religious, a sensitivity to the, now maybe Lacan and Jung would disagree on religion, but where Jung and Lacan both agree is that religion is not just a secular religion is not something that we can just get rid of with a secular deconstruction.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're just gone half an hour in. Maybe this is a time to move into the part of this conversation that I think maybe a little bit harder for listeners to follow. And what I'm trying to do here is actually just preface a different mode of, at least in my case, speaking words. Often I don't make it clear when I'm about to step into something which is really wanting to move into a particular tension with the possibility for generativity, that the very effort of doing that, well, one, is very difficult, but also to actually meet and be responsive to that tension in some sense at the edge of perhaps where we can understand together, can require a kind of voicing that is harder to follow, or at least as I can manage it. So let's see how we do. Okay, so one of the keys here that's coming through is what it is for a person, for a subject, whether we want to say for an ego, and these words obviously really matter depending on what perspective we're coming from. But let's say what it is for that which identifies as undergoing an experience. We can talk about it linguistically, but that gets to the very tension itself, because my question, or the thing I'm pointing to, is that what's really in question is, how does a subject come to form a relationship with something beyond itself or greater than itself, and in fact can come to develop a relationship with that process. And so this is me trying to incorporate a little bit about perhaps what you're getting to with this notion of repetition. It's developing a certain kind of loving relationship with the, in some important sense, inevitable return of the naming structure to meet the world oriented and moved by an energy that in some important sense points beyond itself, sometimes by virtue of what we're calling here desire, in a manner that is in some sense eternal, or in that sense the object of desire is, from a certain perspective, unattainable with respect to this relationship to lack we often speak about, which isn't to say, and so it would become, it seems to me, important to cultivate a relationship to that which we care about, that which we care to realize, that recognizes its embedding in, we haven't used the language of ecology very much, but I think this is why I think it's important to do so, to recognize, for instance, the context beyond whatever a particular thinker or analyst rather, could recognize as healthy by their own standard. In some important sense, we are each while participating in something all here very similar together, and we have an unbelievable amount in common. We can talk about the relationship between subjectivity and system, for instance, and recognize these ways to point to, in some important sense, constants. We can speak about metaphysics and what have you, but there's also a sense in which we participate in unique ways in a context of exchange that itself is always shifting, and that which necessarily asks different local proximal things from us. And so in that trivial sense, no two lives are the same. And the context really, really matters. And in that sense, discernment on the way is to be realized uniquely. And this is super crucial from the perspective of demonization or moralization. But one of the things I also want to bring into this, or to pinpoint more specifically, is this relationship to greater than or beyond oneself. And I'm curious about, because if we speak about someone like Jung, speak about Lacan, there is, at least in what I am influenced in my reading of Jung, not to engage in too much of the scholarly analysis of this, not to back out of that entirely, but at least to my influence, what there is in Jung is an attempt to situate what it is for the individual, or what it is for the self to recognize its transpersonal nature with respect to how it plays into the patterns which are before and beyond it. I wonder, for instance, and this is the final thing I'll say, I wonder if in someone like Freud, who seems to, when it comes to working with people, have a view that looks to analyze ill health by virtue of appeal to a model that may not have enough give in it, certainly not enough depth, breadth, to actually contextualize, in some sense, the infinite that desires in relationship with. Does it all begin in the womb? Is it all about a relationship with the mother and father? Or is there something about what it is for, in some sense, identity to meet possibility very broadly itself, which may allow us to situate how we understand subjectivity in something which comes a little bit closer to reconnecting with the kind of spiritual, religious, theological language that you were beginning to point to in terms of where Lacan might also be enabling a reconnection with. I know I said a lot of things there. I'm wondering if this is getting at some of the tension that might be interesting to speak to particularly with respect to not foreclosing what it is we actually are.
Right. Yeah, you said a lot there. So and just like your last question was very good and very difficult, there's a lot there to chew on. And perhaps with the metaphor of a good meal, we want to take our time with a good meal. We don't want to rush it. We don't want to treat a a high quality steak like a fast food restaurant or something like that. And so before I answer, I just want to say these are the way you're thinking, these types of ways of thinking, these types of ways of crafting voice, these types of ways of wrestling with, struggling with the impossible things to answer are some of the things I hope we can cultivate in the Écrits course, which offers a long form meditation, which offers not final answers or final resolutions to all of our social ills and all of our social mysteries, whether they be economic, whether they be theological, whether they be whatever, but rather opening a space where I think you said it well, where identity can meet possibility, where identity can meet possibility itself. And at the same time, in that space where identity meets possibility itself, I don't think we should create a binary between identity meeting possibility and Oedipal dynamics of the father, the mother, and the womb, yes, and the child.
Yes, absolutely.
In fact, referencing Nietzsche, what is identity meeting possibility itself, if not the child? Right? For Nietzsche, it would be the child itself. The child is the identity that can meet possibility itself. And so thinking about that relationship between the impotent child that struggles with identifications with the father and the mother, and the working through of desire, the working through of, in crude language, the desire to kill, and the desire to fuck, and the desire to eat, and the desire for, all of these impulses, which are very real and lodged inside the subject developmentally. And we have to work with subjects who are not just already fully made, but who are children and teenagers and young adults who are working through these things, and even adults who haven't worked through these things. Right? And that if you foreclose these things in regards to just meeting possibility in this very abstract ideal sense, then you can paradoxically undermine your own possibility. Your own possibility will be undermined by your own Oedipal fixations and your own Oedipal drama to work through and not willing to look at. And because the resistance is very strong to these things, and the intensity is very strong with these things, right? And in my experience, the most strong, and in my sense, the gateway, the key to the real, is passing through these things, not bypassing or escaping these things. But in regards to this idea of a beyond, this idea of a beyond, this idea of a greater than, I think it's precisely at this and even this idea of the transpersonal. It's at this location where I think we can either gain everything or lose everything, depending or not on if we're using the same language, and if we're identifying the same thing, if we're talking about the same thing, and this is where perhaps some of your work with bringing together people from different theological traditions, people from different religious and spiritual traditions, is not only so important, but so important to deepen and extend this act of what does it mean to have a Zen monk and a Sufi mystic and a Catholic bishop in the room together, right? In some sense, this is where Lacan would feast, This is where Lacan probably would get a lot of ideas about what do all of these things mean, and also, to me, the interesting question in regards to subject and system is the way in which the subject can identify with a system of thoughts that we might call Zen, or that we might call Catholicism, or that we might call fill in the blank. And what's the difference between, say, a Buddha or a Christ or a Brahmin? You fill in the blank. What's the difference between actually those subjects and a system of thoughts, a system of presuppositions, which a subject is using as a coping mechanism for Oedipal dramas? Right? Like, these are the types of psychoanalytic questions that come to my mind. Right? And oftentimes I actually have, I wrestle with religion, I wrestle with theology, I wrestle with these things in the same way I'd wrestle with philosophy in some sense, and science. But one of the biggest problems, like I often say to myself, religion would be great. The problem is oftentimes religious people. Sometimes that's the case. Is that, and this is something that comes out in Lacan's work, I think, very strongly, is when you submit to the transpersonal domain of discourse, and someone is speaking to you about a set of systemic propositions, in what sense are you being subjected to? In what sense are you being addressed in a way that is a type of dyadic master-slave dynamic? And this comes out in Lacan's work all the time. Lacan's he's always talking about what he calls Hegelian murder. And for Lacan, Hegelian murder is this becoming submitted to a master-slave dynamic in discourse itself.
Right.
Actually, when someone's speaking to you and approaching you so with the appearance of an angel, with the appearance of God, with the appearance of Jesus, with the appearance of Buddha, but is actually cutting you slowly.
Yeah, right.
This is very dark stuff. So, but these are the types of things we might want to think about in the course.
Yeah, awesome.
Can I say one more thing about the identity meeting possibility in the Oedipal drama?
Of course.
I would like to situate this in the context of the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari and the anti-Oedipus doctrine. Because I think there's obviously a tremendous conversation, which I am not willing to close too quickly, on the question of Deleuze, Guattari's philosophy and anti-Oedipus. I have my ideas about it. I pay attention to the cultural consequences of it. However, I do suspect that our capacity to really meet with possibility itself can sometimes be undermined by doctrines that follow anti-Oedipus. And this is here making the distinguishment between Deleuze and Guattari themselves, who are obviously exceptionally well-read in philosophy and psychoanalysis, and bring forth a type of schizoanalysis, which is its whole other conversation. And the very real fact that many subjects, I think, are clearly struggling with identifications of an Oedipal nature. And how do we deal with that? And the fact that a lot of what society is, in some sense, does look a lot like a Deleuzian society, where you as an individuation are supposed to abstract away any intimate connections to a father, a mother, a child, And we are in some sense seeing, especially in the Western context, the decline of reproduction and the decline of the family and the decline of the father and the decline of real parenting. And what does it mean to bring back to the real conversation of possibility today as the child, the father, and the mother in the picture of that possibility? And here, this is where my conversation with Daniel Tutt on the psychoanalysis of the family is. Daniel Tutt's thinking in a very, for him, Marxist psychoanalytic sense and a communist sense is, how can we think the family as revolutionary? Oftentimes we think about the family as something to overcome. We think about the family as something to that is preventing our liberation, that is in antagonism with our liberation. But what if Daniel Tutt suggesting that the family is the condition of possibility for a way to actually transcend base level commodification in a world where we are reduced to, our individuation is reduced to a commodity, right? Can we think families of revolution? Can we think families of revolution on the level of commodity, where we don't have to be just so governed by rules of commodification in our individuation?
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I think that's all really key. Probably what I should do is try to have a crack here at articulating, crystallizing what the key tension is, the key dynamic is here we're sort of circling around. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it in one go, but we'll see what you get. Well, one distinction might be between just copying versus really living a thing. Copying the moves or realizing them for yourself, even if those moves turn out to be a sequence that's extremely well trodden. There's a difference between enlivening and actualizing and affirming, and in that sense, living one's truth and being, whether subversively or otherwise, constrained into it in a way that suffocates something truly vital in it. This relationship, for instance, between spirit and religion, subject and system, whether Freud's view of what constitutes a particular Oedipal complex versus the actual presentation of the energies and dynamics that Freud was pointing to, and yet there's something in the perspective of Freud himself, something in the perspective of what model or map says about the presentation of something, which is always prone to, it's something like, use the word cut. I like thinking about these things in terms of part making and whole making. And part of the sort of critical question I have for psychoanalysis, at least at an altogether too, in a sense, a kind of trivial way of postulating what psychoanalysis is, just if you look at what the words mean. If we take psyche, we're talking something, self, soul, broadly speaking, the nature of subject, first person, okay? And then analysis, as I understand that term, for the most part, we are speaking about wanting to understand something in terms of what its parts are. And parts make sense with respect to a whole. Parts make sense with respect to a system. And there's something about how the image of a particular whole or the image of a particular system can inappropriately delimit the verb, the becoming, the being as a verb of what it is to actually live out the many parts that one is. I like thinking about, there's something about whole making, there's something about participating in a greater than, not to bypass the various ways we're conditioned, but with respect to what it is subjectivity participates in, with respect to the nature of creation and intelligibility and possibility as potential. In this conversation, I'm seeing possibility and potential. I think about them in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
The tension I'm pointing to here and what we seem to be in agreement about, and I think this is where there can be, like, there need not, from my perspective, we can be, I like being influenced by thinkers, but not stuck in discourses where it's this thinker's thinking and this thinker's thinking, as if there wasn't some participation in intelligibility and understanding and not knowing that we can meet each other in and relate with now. And I like how you spoke to something like that as very much being in the spirit of invitation as part of the course. And, you know, this is something I strive to do in my own work, and hopefully what we attempt to, or we attempt to exemplify. But there's, in any thinker, in any system, even this way of thinking about dreams, because I don't think we can foreclose what, in some sense, the message is the meaning of dreams. I'm always wary of solely seeking to interpret the meaning of those dreams with respect to what I can presently understand about my life, even though I'm so involved, even though it's so relevant to my life and is colored by my life and my history and all of that. But there's something about what it is to connect and participate in the intelligibility and the quality of subjectivity that is conditioning what identity meets in relation, that seems to, it certainly exceeds what it can encapsulate in some final order. And therefore there's a humility about the, in some sense, the broader picture, the bigger picture that we can come to see ourselves as involved in. I'll stop there. I don't know how much of that is coming through. As I feel what I'm doing here is, in some sense, partly reflecting, but not reflecting without obviously sourcing it from the depths of what I can bring into some sort of voice. And so there's this attempt in that sense to vibrate like a meaning back, but I am in some sense attempting to speak to, in a sense, what I'm kind of hearing you speak to. I don't know if that comes through.
I do have perhaps a way to reflect back what I think you're trying to point at, which comes up again and again, is this participation in a greater than with respect to myself as a subject. So I guess for Lacan, the participation in a greater than would have to do with the trans individuality of discourse itself. Like what's in some sense, and even like to me signifiers like the Holy Spirit might fit here, in the sense of what's greater than me is the community and communities of discourse. Yeah.
Can I just jump in here to say, when I hear discourse, I can find a lot of utility in that at the level of, you know, Greg Henriquez will speak about justification systems, right? And he sees them as an emergent layer of what's possible in terms of complex communication that can only occur after various other joint points, various other planes of complexity have come into being, right? Got to have culture, got to have and so discourse is often wrapped together with language. The way I relate to this, because I'm not in, like, I can see that picture, and I'm not necessarily situating you in that way of thinking. I can see that picture. I can see the value in thinking this way. Certainly we are conditioned by discourse, and it's very, very powerful. You can do an awful lot with that. Part of me is wanting to widen discourse. Instead of discourse, I hear what I want to say is communication. And I want to say communication because I want to open up energetic exchange that we participate in, that we orient affectively, a quality of interbeing, a quality of communication that in some important sense opens up. Yes, it opens itself into discourse, but purely an analysis of discourse may not be enough to actually acquaint us with what it is to animate the energies associated with that also inform our discernment with respect to what we identify with in discourse.
Here's where we get into the importance of being precise with technical terminology. So like when I was saying, for example, Lacan emphasizing what's greater than us is discourse. Well, let's go into the definition. What does Lacan mean when he says discourse? So the technical definition would be, Lacan uses the term, and I'm drawing this right from a Lacanian encyclopedia. Lacan uses the term discourse to emphasize the trans-individual nature of language, the fact that speech always implies an other subject, an interlocutor. So here, when we get into what Lacan's saying by discourse, he's not just thinking of discourse in terms of a system of symbols that are dead. He's thinking in terms of discourse as something which needs to be enlivened and is by definition enlivened by the other.
Right. Beautiful.
And not just reduction, and not just reduction to an already a priori set of categories, but the fact of speech. And speech is in some sense freed in Lacan from language as a system of categories. So fundamentally, when we're thinking about something greater than ourselves, it's like for Lacan anyway, it's a trans-individual discourse between self and other, which transcends any one of us particularly, and as a particular being, and requires to be alive to the other. So what's very important, and from the very first page of the Écrits, is that Lacan not only emphasizes style of speech, but style of speech in relationship to the other, or the other one addresses. So for Lacan, about addressing the other and the style in which you address the other. And to him, that's basically what discourse means. Now, I think that emphasizes that some of the Lacanian, like I just had a conversation with Samuel McCormick, who's a Lacanian, and he's a professor of communication studies. So Lacan has a wide influence in many different fields, but one of the fields in which he's got a large influence is communication studies. So this emphasis on communication, and not just sort of a system of language. And let's be also clear that Lacan was very critical of many linguists of his day, including Noam Chomsky, in terms of the way they would theorize language. And Lacan was mostly influenced by theories of language derived from the field of anthropology. So thinkers like Claude Levi-Strauss were important for Lacan, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Lacan saw his alignment in linguistic circles with those in anthropology, because he was interested in the living speech of tribal dynamics, for example, or the living speech of like real community life, for example. So those are things that come up in Lacan. But let me just speak to a moment in regards to this, the way you're thinking in terms of parts and wholes, in regards to the greater than. I think the crucial thing with Lacan in introducing the subject is that he's introducing a whole in language. And when I mean a whole in language, I mean HOLE. So he's introducing a whole in language. And that whole in language for Lacan is the subject. And a lot of what Lacan's going through in analysis is going from the imaginary, which he calls filling that hole with a specular image of wholeness, of completeness, of, he'll use that language, to the real of the whole as such.
With a W.
So no, so the specular image would be the whole with a W.
Gotcha.
To the whole of the real as HOLE. Now here you think about the emergent. Now think about this: the emergence of a subject from a whole, as whole, HOLE, like being birthed out of a whole. And so in some sense, the question of the whole with a WHOLE to me is a question of, are we talking about that whole on the level of a subject specular image of wanting to be whole, of desiring to be whole? Or are we thinking about the real whole, WHOLE, of trans-individual discourse? In some sense, the whole the whole WHOLE, if we're talking about, so we could use categories of what is the real of the whole WHOLE. I think for Lacan, it would be precisely this trans-individual discourse, which goes on and 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 on. And the capacity to interact with that trans-individual discourse requires being real, meaning accepting your whole, HOLE, which means being true to you as a subject, and speaking to the lack, which you, in some sense, not presenting yourself as a out. Like, in other words, admission to the whole WHOLE is on the condition of becoming a whole HOLE. Because if I come to the whole WHOLE as a whole HOLE, then I'm coming truly as submitting to something greater than myself. something greater than myself, something beyond myself, something which transcends myself, and I come to it as, in some sense, again, not this inflated figure of a great man, but as a whole. And I think that's what Lacan would. I think that's where he would point.
Right. So to use some different language, perhaps it's very curious, isn't it? Because you have in Jung's answer to Job and similar lines of thinking in relation here. Anderson Todd, who's a neo-Jungian who I've spoken to on the podcast, spoke to this in an interesting way. I've heard Jordan Peterson speak to something along these lines as well, and other Jungians. We have, what I'm trying to present is sort of paradigmatic examples of sort of archetypal examples of relationship to greater than. We can say God in some sense as well. In the case of answer to Job, the story of Job being one where this is a dude who's, and I'm not a biblical scholar, hey, but so in the version I have stored in my mind, we have a figure who has tried really hard and has done some, in principle, good things and just keeps on getting shat on. And there's something of a challenge that he poses. There's a questioning to God in relation, but in a way that isn't at least presented as egotistical or inappropriate. In some important sense, I see it as a mode of, I've used the language sometimes, confrontation, an appropriate confrontation, seeing the relationship between confrontation and surrender. And when I think about whole in the sense of HOLE, I think about something that is willing to be filled. In that sense, something that's willing to accept the influence of other, to meet that process, and to, in that sense, affirm a relating with and living of life in this time and place, in that sense, to accept in the context of its time, and to meet in a particular transformative union by virtue of an orientation of surrender. But there's also a time to, in some important sense, resist, or to speak from the dignity of what is already given in the creative spirit, or just of what is already given in the very fact of one's being in the world as a whole with an H. The very fact of being present in a dress at all is an influence that is worthy of a certain kind of respect, right? In a sense of, if we're wanting to relate with what participates in truth. And so I wonder about this. I wonder about it's in some sense the subject is, yes, it's both a whole with an H and a whole with a W, and perhaps that's why I think think mostly in terms of the verbs. It's you know, obviously a process, and the tension and the grapple and is that, you know, we have to live in this time, and yet we are of deep time as well. We are of the always already, and we're of the future. At least we participate in that which transcends us. We participate in greater than. In that sense, it is not, yes, it's like there's a sense of like a bowing down and a sense of fate, but at the same time, this relationship we have to choice as imbued through us is part of that process. And so this continued wrestle between that we always return to, that which presents itself as meta language or ideology or fixed, you know, whatever the structure is, religion or what have you, and then that which in some sense is both conditioned by that, but because it's conditioned by that, it's also it's like that, yeah. It does very much come back to the child again. I could finish that sentence a little bit better, but I'm going to stop there because I'm just going to keep on repeating the same thing in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, what was curious about that thread to me is, you know, you starting off with the story of Job, and it's a really interesting story. And perhaps we can all, in our own way, relate to that story of trying really hard, doing some good things, and you keep getting shit on, metaphorically, and that this challenge this challenge emerges. And if I was to make sense of this, regards to what we're talking about with the whole and the whole, so the HOLE and the WHOLE, I would make sense of it in relationship to the specular image and the real. So this Job character, and I don't know if I'm right, I'm just relating this to some Lacanian thought that might help us approach this challenge of Job's story. Let's say Job is trying really hard, doing some good things, but he's still working with a narcissistic specular image. Like he thinks he's doing something for the whole in the WHOLE sense. But actually what he's doing is for his imaginary specular image. It's for a narcissistic fusion. And so the challenge there is, what does it really mean to become a whole at HOLE that has, in some sense, allowed the whole, the WHOLE, to really move through them? In other words, what does it really mean to overcome the narcissistic specular image and to really have discourse in that way we were talking about earlier move through them for the Voicecraft, which is the trans-individual nature, which is the other, which is, and being there for the other. And it seems to me like in this, now there's a distinction that I've learned in making the course for the Écrits, which has stuck out to me, which is the distinction between reaction and response. Reaction is mechanical. Reaction is, in some sense, perhaps a speech which is too tightly linked to the specular image. And you can see if someone's reacting, they're getting triggered because their image is in jeopardy. Versus a response. It seems to me a response is non-mechanical. It's perhaps teleological in the sense of the other.
Yep.
It's a telos in relationship to the other,
Yep.
which is contextual and irreducible to that situation. And
Yes.
the capacity to be the capacity to embed oneself truly in discourse which transcends and which is greater than oneself is the capacity to respond and not react.
Mm-hmm.
Something
Yes.
like that, and maybe that helps us with Job and this thing that trying really hard and doing some good things matters only insofar as it's real and not a specular illusion. And this is something that I'm just here really speaking as a subject who resonates and in some sense struggles with this challenge of Job in that sense.
Yeah, so I definitely like the distinction between reaction and response, and I use those two in the same way, and find that, I mean, so you'll find that people like Gabor Mate, Viktor Frankl, these types of psychotherapeutic, psychological influences in discourse would make this similar distinction, I think. And I think it's you know, it is a matter, it seems, of, and perhaps here I feel things coming to a close a little bit, because it feels like to me that we've, in a sense, there's a finding each other in the mystery of what it is we're doing and how we're relating to the various projects we're involved in, the communication right now, and then broadly speaking. Because in returning to response, we again open up into potential and I keep coming so close to forgetting that we're doing this as a stream, and so the continued experience of, okay, I've got to talk, you've got to talk, but the reality is that I don't so much feel like talking. I feel like I'm understanding. I'm feeling like that there's, what I'm hearing from you and your articulation of Lacanian thinking is one that it feels to me like for the particular kind of poetic thinker that I am, it's a helpful accomplice, because I like this relationship between poetry and rigor. And I think in Lacan there is language that can help at least certain types of people who are so interested to come to relate with the mystery of participating in creativity as that which itself has already been created. And so it's this relationship between wanting to contribute and at the same time having been so strongly conditioned and finding oneself so incredibly embedded in expectation, in pathos, in all these things. And I feel like on the one hand, there's you could read some poetry through Lacan, and at the same time, I do think that many people will benefit. I can feel that there's a benefit there from engaging with Lacanian thinking as a means to open up how one relates to their own creativity. And so
Absolutely.
There's so many mysterious ways we find ourselves in that process. the relationships we build, are we enabling each other to be who we are, and all the paradox that that is. And so that's why I'm, you know, really excited about, actually, I'm excited about what I'm beginning to feel as well, a number of years of sort of being part of cultivating online conversation, even in just a small way. I'm really noticing people who I've known for some years develop their own thinking and learn different languages. And many of my friends have been influenced by you. I've certainly been influenced by you. I feel like in the conversations we've had, is actually, it feels like there's influencing of each other in some important ways.
Absolutely.
And so it's in that sense that I'm really quite excited about what follows from this, because it's an awesome thing to be part of. It's an awesome thing to be part of conversations and discourse where people more and more generate a sense of how to communicate with each other, and then encounter in many respects the same tensions played out in different ways. And in some sense, we are looking for the opportunity to live our own lives, make our own mistakes, and really respond to the world as we meet it now. And beautiful, man. Any final thoughts from you about the course and this conversation and the invitation for people?
Absolutely. So thank you. And definitely the influence and the inspiration is a shared one in regards to what you're doing with Voicecraft, and hopefully what's to come in the future through both Philosophy Portal and Voicecraft, because I think that both the attempt to, let's say, market philosophy and the attempt to cultivate a attention and deep awareness and respect for the voice are not easy things to survive in neoliberal what's often called late capitalism. And at the same time, perhaps the most precious aspects, I think, that we can give to the other. And so, as I've heard you say in a podcast, but if you follow the breadcrumbs, there's something real here. Hey, and I like that you said that, because I feel like that's what we're really building here, is that we've got an adjacent communities where if you do follow the breadcrumbs, there is something here.
Yeah.
You know, I just tell a story that when I was in my doctorate, I was looking at different institutes and research programs that I might be interested in following after I was finished. And there are a lot of great websites, good design websites. And I remember one time I went to one of the, I followed the breadcrumbs from one of these websites, and there was nothing there. There was nothing behind the nice website. But I think for myself, I'll speak for myself, and I think I see that in Voicecraft, is that, you know, we try to create something online, but there is also something there behind the image. There is something real there. And to use Lacanian language. And I think when you said about the relationship between poetry and rigor, there's no better way to describe Lacan's work than the relationship between poetry and rigor. It's absolutely an attempt to unify those two. It's an absolute joy to read. It's poetic. His capacity to, just like, I guess, all great thinkers, like I could say the same thing about Nietzsche, for example. So you know you're reading Nietzsche, right? Like when you're reading Nietzsche, you know you're reading Nietzsche. You can't get out of the style of that guy. And I think the same thing goes for Lacan, is that you know you're reading Lacan. His style is absolutely unique. But absolutely, there's a rigor there too. And what's at stake in working with Lacan over a long period of time, like we're going to do with the Écrits course, is that you're going to see that rigor, and not just get confused with some poetic phrasing. You're going to see that there's a deep, deep rigor there. And where is that rigor coming from? Well, if you're a physicist and there's a rigor in your physics, well, it's coming from ultimately either physical experiments or mathematical and complex ideation. With Lacan, it's coming from the affectivity of discourse. What Lacan, the rigor that Lacan's speaking to is the emotion, the affect of discourse. What can we learn from affective speech, from speech in the intensity of affect? It's coming out of that. And I think, and that's not only Lacan, of course, I think that's the value of psychoanalysis is, and that's why Lacan brings us to this question of, are there psychoanalysts, is how difficult it is to be with those deepest affects, and to also pay attention to the complexities of discourse in that space, and what we can learn in that space. Right. So I guess that's all I'll say, and just again sort of extend my thanks for you for this conversation, because I genuinely felt like I've learned new connection points and ways of thinking about, for example, the relationship between parts and wholes in the ways in which I'm trying to think about this myself. Trans individuality, the relationship between the subject and system, like in the book we've discussed. I think is a very important through line, and also religion and theology and spirituality and all of these themes, and the complex ways in which psychoanalysis is engaged there. So I'll just say, look, the course starts September 3rd. There's an application for a scholarship where the deadline is August 22nd through Voicecraft. If you follow the breadcrumbs, there's also opportunities through OG Rose and Alex Ebert. I'll end there.
Beautiful, mate. Thank you very much. It's been a powerful conversation, and I look forward to many more.